Okay. This is just a continuation of the same thing. Nonetheless, to see where Lai or I'm gonna look. Okay. Lao's account. Lao just seems like a cool name. Lao's account meets the intrinsic value condition. We need to determine whether the genetic basis for moral agency has intrinsic value. Lao 2010 says little about this. Nonetheless, the intrinsic value of a particular property is almost often justified according to an intuitive sense we have about the value of that property and whether it is valuable independent of whether we personally value it, alongside considerations about overall structure of values. So we should imagine what it would be like if genetic material did have intrinsic value. If this were so, then genetic material itself would have be valuable. Okay, let me see if I can understand this. Nonetheless, intrinsic value is a particular property. So this, I think I tried to draw it up here. It's already down here right now. Nonetheless, the intrinsic value of a particular property is almost justified according to an intuitive sense we have about the value of that property and whether it's valuable independent of what we personally think or consider it, alongside consideration about its overall structure of value. So we should imagine that it would be like if genetic material did have intrinsic value. So let's say uh, this is genetic material, we value it, or it's valuable in of itself. It's just that right there. So we should imagine, if it were so, then genetic material itself would be valuable, independent of other values. However, it seems fairly unintuitive for genetic material to possess this kind of value. Genetic material often seems an excellent example of something that lacks intrinsic value or end value whatsoever. Indeed, it may seem concerning to think what is intrinsically valuable about you is specific genes. Genes are something which simply cause our bodies to constitute themselves in the ways we find to be valuable. Instead, we should normally explain the value of genetic material is what it gives rise to. Okay. In this case, moral agency. So, on first impression, genetic material does not therefore seem to be doing the necessary work demanded of a morally relevant feature for determining the scope of dignity. So I guess, yeah, this produces, let's say this, but it's this that you, you value. So even if you so-called value this, if this, let's say L, if L did not produce X, then it seems like L would not be valuable if it's the case that L is possesses the property like P, which makes it intrinsically valuable, irregardless of whatever it comes arise to. Then it wouldn't be the case that if it doesn't produce X, that it would still, or that it would lose. Then that it would lose, is a valuable. What makes it valuable? Something like that. Maybe is that what he's talking about? Let's see. Uh, Adion. Okay, there you go. Question went through. I basically just asked it a very convoluted question and get it off my head. Is it saying here that G genes has P property because it gives rise to MA moral agency? If G didn't give rise to P, it would still or still not be valuable. I don't understand. Yeah, you're reading it in the right direction. I'll slow it down so it's super clear. Let's name the pieces first. G equal genetic base for moral agency. The special gene slash genome setup. Next is MA, moral agency, being able to understand right, wrong, act on moral reasons. Dignity equal direction, direct moral claim, right against others, being someone who can be wronged or not, just something that can be damaged. Now here's the other doing in your quote. Like Leo or what says humans have dignity because they have G, okay, genetic basis for moral agency. So for him, it's not you already a moral agent. It's you come because you have a genetic program for your to become a moral agent. That's supposed to cover babies, coma patients, etc. Step two, the author's test. The author is like, okay, cool, but for something to grant dignity, it has to have intrinsic value. Intrinsic value equal valuable in and of itself or in itself just by existing, even if it doesn't produces anything. Extrinsic or instrumental value equal valuable only because of what it leads to or causes. So the question is, does G, the genetic basis, having have genetic value? Because if it doesn't, it can't grant dignity. Step three, the problem for Lao. The author says if we look at G, the genetic basis, it doesn't feel intrinsically valuable. It just feels like biological instructions, DNA code, not scared by itself. Instead, why do we care about G? Because it causes moral agency later. So the value of G seems to be this DNA is good because it eventually produces a morally significant capacity moral agency. That means its value is derivative. If it's valuable because of what it gives rise to, not valuable as itself. It is it saying here that G and P G has P because it gives rise to M and A, but if G didn't give rise to M A, it would still or still not be valuable. Uh, if the author is saying G is not valuable because it leads to MA or and it didn't lead to MA, it wouldn't be valuable in a way we need for dignity. Answer is yes. That's the punchline. The author is saying if these genes did not produce moral agency, then we would not think these genes themselves are morally special. That shows that these genes are not valuable in themselves. They are only valuable as tools for getting to something else we care about. But dignity, the thing that gives you direct rights and makes it possible to wrong you, has to be grounded in something valuable itself, not just something that's a tool. Otherwise, we're not respecting you. We're just respecting or we're just protecting a useful instrument. So if G didn't lead to a moral agency, G would have no special value, which means G does not have intrinsic value, which means G does cannot be thing cannot be a thing that explains why you have dignity. That's why the author says Leo's Mose fails to do necessary work. The genetic basis looks like a cause of something valuable, not itself, which intrinsic valuable is what's supposed to grant dignity. Super short, Leo. Yeah, but why does it matter if you're if the P that makes you valuable is all is only an instrument for something that's actually morally considerable. Why isn't good enough? P equals some feature you have, like certain genes, but P only matters because it leads to X, and X is the thing that actually morally important. Why can't P still count as the thing that gives you dignity or moral status? Let's walk through it slowly because this is the heart of the paper. I'll call you, the being whose status we're trying to justify. One, dignity is supposed to justify direct claims. The paper treats dignity as something that makes you the kind of being who can say, "You owe this to me and you wronged me." That's a direct claim. Your dignity is supposed to generate duties towards you. If that's true, then whatever grounds your dignity has to make direct matter. So the ground in property has to be something whose value is in you and not just in what might someday produce or in what you're useful for. Uh, Now suppose P is instrumental value doesn't make you the point. Now suppose P is only valuable as a tool for something else. This means we aren't valuing U slash P, we're valuing X. You're being protected only because you're on the path to X. That's not the same thing as you yourself having moral standing. That's just you being a convenient delivery system. Here's an analogy. Example, the violinist hands. Let's say the violinist can play music that cures depression in millions of people. Do their hands have value instrumentally? Yeah, they produce the world healing music. But if someone injures their hand, is the deepest wrong to the hands or is it to the people who lose healing music? We don't say the hands have rights, we say the person has rights. Why? Because hands are valuable as a means. They do not generate claims on us by themselves. The person does. So merely being a mean to something else valuable does not make the means itself a dignity bearer. Apply the logic to about G equal genetic basis, X equal moral agency. If G matters only because it might eventually produce X, and respecting G is just respecting a tool on the way to X. G is like the hands, not the person. So G cannot explain why you already deserve respect. The author is using very specific tests. A property has intrinsic value if it's worth respecting in itself, even if it never leads to anything else. A property has instrumental value if it's worth respecting only because of its effect slash output slash future. For dignity, we need something intrinsic because dignity is supposed to say it would be wrong to violate me, even if it didn't help anyone or lead to anything good, else good. If the thing you're pointing to, like genes, would stop mattering the second it stopped producing some future capacity, then it's not intrinsic, which means it can't carry more load of "you wronged me" because because then the story becomes you're not wronging me, you're just obstructing the production of X. I'm reduced to a pipeline that feels the idea that I'm a source of a claim. Bring it back to the fetus, coma. Lyle tries to say even non-functional human beings, let's say fetuses, newborns, coma patients, still have dignity because they have the right genetic basis for moral agency. The critic can say, but if those genes are only valuable because they might produce moral agency later, and if we'd stop caring about those genes in case where they couldn't produce moral agency, for example, in anencephaly or catastrophic brain damage, then those genes aren't still, I don't know, then those genes are not being treated as having value in themselves. They're being treated as a tool for future possibilities, not as a tool that's already grounds a present moral claim. So those agents, so those genes cannot be a thing that makes you makes that being already inviolatable. Okay. Dignity is supposed to mean blah. Might you better for your own sake. To explain this, you have a point to something in you that is valuable for your own sake. If something you point to is only valuable because it leads to something else, then the something else is what matters to you, not you. What matters, not you. I get it. And then you're not actually being treated as an end, you're being treated as a means. That that's not acceptable as a foundation for dignity slash direct moral claim. Okay. Nonetheless, um, unless to see whether Lao's account meets the intrinsic value condition, we determine whether the genetic basis for moral agency has intrinsic value. Lao 2010 says little about this. Nonetheless, the intrinsic value of a particular property is most often justified according to an intuitive sense we have about the value of that property and whether it is valuable independently of whether we personally value it alongside considerations about overall structure of value. So we should imagine what it would be like if the genetic material did have intrinsic value. If this were so, then the genetic material itself would be valuable independent of other values. However, it seems fairly unintuitive for genetic material to wait. Mm, hmm. Interesting. Never mind. However, it seems fairly unintuitive for genetic material to possess this kind of value. Genetic material often Genetic material often seems an excellent example of something that lacks intrinsic value or end value whatsoever. Indeed, it may seem concerning to think that what is intrinsically valuable about you is specific genes. Genes are something which simply causes our body to constitute itself in the ways we find to be valuable. Instead of what normally explains the value of genetic material is what gives rise to in the case of moral agency. To our first impressions, genetic material does not therefore seem to be doing the necessary work demanded of a morally relevant feature for determining the scope of dignity. To get greater purchase on this, we can consider the um, alternate alongside a place of the genetic basis in the overall structure of value. That is, if the genetic basis does not have intrinsic value, it its value is likely going to be extrinsic if it has any value at all. If genetic material were only extrinsically valuable, it would derive its value from somewhere else, such as agency. So we would only really value it because we value whatever it derives its value from. Outside of the considerations of dignity's grounds, it makes more sense to say think about genetic material in this way. Genetic material may be valuable and importantly so because it is not the non-derivative source of the value of dignity possessing beings. It seems more justified to place or emphasis on what the genetic basis is deriving its value from. In this case, that which actually does grant dignity, whatever that may be. But that may be too quick. We may want to consider our options further. One possibility is that we should weaken what it means to fulfill intrinsic value condition. Seems to suggest something of this sort when he claims that the genetic basis could still be morally important even if it only has instrumental value. A weakened value condition might therefore state that the morally relevant property should simply have some value. To consider this idea, let me focus on the most plausible options available. To consider this idea, let me focus on the most plausible option available.